I know a lot of you guys are wedding photographers, and if you're looking to upgrade your camera, you might be looking at the Canon R6. I've been shooting on the Canon R6 for a few months now. I've been shooting some elopements and small weddings, and I'd like to run you through some of my pros and cons and some of my first impressions. So let's get into it. So just to give you a reference point, I came from the Canon 5D Mark IIIs. Obviously those are DSLRs, and the Canon R6 is a mirrorless camera, so right off the bat it's going to be a lot smaller, a lot lighter. The controls on the back of the camera are actually quite similar to all the other Canon cameras, so it didn't take me too long to get used to those. So coming from a bit of an older camera, one of the first things that I noticed about this was the autofocus, how fast it is and how sharp it is. It is crazy fast. I thought maybe some of my Sigma lenses were getting a little bit soft, but I'm thinking now that it was actually the Canon 5D Mark IIIs. Even my Sigma 35 is like tack sharp on this. The digital viewfinder might take a little bit of time getting used to, but in my opinion, the future is mirrorless and everyone's gonna have to get used to that. I actually kind of like it now because you can see the exposure of the image before you actually take it. So first we're gonna talk about some pros. Now our first pro is the facial tracking feature. This feature is really useful, especially as a wedding photographer and portrait photographer, because the camera will look for people's faces, specifically their eyes, and focus, and that will be the sharpest point in the image. And it's actually incredibly good at finding that. When I first found the feature, I was kind of wondering how it would do, especially for walking photos, running photos, but it's surprisingly good. I usually get my couples to move a lot, and no matter how much they move, somehow it manages to find their faces and focus on that. So that has been a huge benefit for me having this camera as opposed to my 5D Mark IIIs. Now another thing that I didn't know if I would actually like is one of my favorite things about the camera, and that is the weight and the size. Coming from the 5Ds, this thing feels like a feather. At the end of a 10-hour day before, my wrists would just be killing me. Now depending on what kind of lens you have on these, obviously it can get heavy, but for the most part these have been a wrist saver. Another thing that I really like about this camera is the flip screen. I know a lot of cameras these days have flip screens, but coming from an older camera, this was a huge benefit. Yeah, the flip screen is awesome. It's also a touch screen, so you can touch to focus, which is great if I'm shooting above or from below. Another thing that's really awesome about this camera is the low light capabilities. I know as wedding photographers, sometimes we find ourselves shooting in like blue hour or past the sunset, or at receptions it can be really dim lighting. So having a camera that can shoot awesome shots in low light settings is really important. I'll show you a couple of photos that I took at a recent shoot where the lighting was really low and I had to crank my ISO up. So these images were shot after sunset around blue hour. I was shooting at ISO 5000. I definitely could have gone a little slower with the shutter speed. Looks like I had my shutter at 1/320th of a second, but it gives you a good idea of what the noise looks like with 5000 ISO. In this next image, I'll zoom in a little bit to show you guys the noise. I usually end up adding grain to my images anyways, so I was pretty happy with how these images turned out despite that little bit of noise that you see in the shadows and highlights. But yeah, it gives you a good idea of how good these cameras are in low light. Another pro that I didn't really think I would love about this camera is how quiet this shutter is. It's kind of a buzzkill to be photographing an intimate wedding or first look where your shutter is just obnoxiously going off in the background. So to have a quiet shutter has been really awesome. Now because this camera has such good facial tracking features and autofocus, I find myself taking way less photos because I just have way more usable photos. Before I would come home from a wedding with like 5,000 images, and now I can shoot a full wedding with like 3,000 photos to go through, and that really cuts down on my calling time, which ultimately means I can deliver the images faster. Okay, so let's move on to why we're all here, the cons of the Canon R6. Now I haven't noticed a lot, honestly it's a pretty good camera, but we have to talk about a couple of things. Number one is the battery life. It's just not that great. Between the digital viewfinder, the constant autofocus, and using the back of the screen a lot more, it just really cuts down on the battery life. I find myself switching out the batteries more frequently than I did with my 5Ds. And I know that you can get battery packs for these cameras, and I'll probably get one of those for this upcoming wedding season, but yeah, battery life is one thing to keep in mind. Now another arguable con is the sensor size. So the Canon 5D Mark IIIs, for example, had 22 megapixel sensors, and this guy only has a 20 megapixel sensor. Depending on how much you crop your images and how big you're going to print them, it really shouldn't matter that much. Now my last con, which is just a result of going mirrorless, is that now I'm using an RF mount as opposed to the EF mount on the DSLRs. Now this isn't a huge con because Canon does sell this adapter for I think around 130 bucks, and it works really good. So I'm currently using my EF lenses on the R6 just with this adapter. Now Canon of course has RF lenses, and they're making more RF lens lines, but for right now using the EF lenses on here works great. Maybe in the future I'll invest in some RF lenses. Okay guys, I think that's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comments if you've come up with any more pros or cons for the R6, or if you have any questions. I'll definitely be linking this, the adapter, the battery pack, and a few other things in the description below, so make sure you check that out.